The weight of inexperience. Private James Holloway had fired his M1 Garand exactly 47 times in combat, and not a single bullet had found its mark. The rifle itself was flawless, manufactured at Springfield Armory in 1943, inspected, oiled, and issued with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had processed Holloway himself through induction, basic training, and transatlantic deployment. The problem was not the weapon. The problem, as Sergeant Kowalski had observed with characteristic bluntness during a lull in fighting 3 days prior, was that Holloway couldn't hit the broad side of a barn if he were standing inside it. The comment had drawn tired laughter from the squad, the kind of humor that soldiers use to soften the edges of fear. But Holloway had not laughed. He had nodded, checked his rifle's action for the 100th time, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Kowalski was right. It was late October 1944, and the 28th Infantry Division was grinding its way through the Hurtgen Forest, a sector of the Western Front that would later be remembered as one of the most brutal and unforgiving environments of the European campaign. The forest was dense, ancient, and indifferent to the machinery of modern war. Trees absorbed artillery shells and fractured into shrapnel. Fog clung to the undergrowth well into the afternoon. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles, and the Germans exploited every advantage the terrain offered. They had been fighting in this forest for weeks, knew its contours, its ravines, its approaches. Holloway's unit had been rotated into the line 6 days earlier, relieving a battalion that had been reduced to half strength. The men they replaced had moved past them in silence, faces hollow, eyes fixed on nothing. No one had offered advice or encouragement. There was no wisdom to impart, only the understanding that survival here was a matter of luck, endurance, and the ability to kill before being killed. Holloway was 19 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the son of a machinist and a school teacher, and he had enlisted in the spring of 1943 with a cluster of classmates who had all assured each other that the war would be over before they saw any real fighting. By the time he completed basic training at Camp Croft in South Carolina, those same friends were scattered across North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. Holloway had been assigned to a replacement depot in England, spent 3 months in a staging camp near Southampton, and finally crossed the Channel in early October as part of a batch of reinforcements intended to replenish units that had been mauled during the push toward the German border. He had arrived at the front with a new uniform, a clean rifle, and the kind of nervous energy that experienced soldiers recognized immediately as the mark of someone who had not yet been tested. His marksmanship during training had been adequate but unremarkable. He had qualified with the M1, passed the basic standards, and never displayed the natural aptitude that some recruits seemed to possess without effort. On the range, with instructors barking corrections and targets that did not shoot back, he had managed to place rounds on paper at 200 yards. But the range had been flat, predictable, and devoid of the variables that defined actual combat. There had been no mud, no exhaustion, no incoming fire, no adrenaline turning his hands into something he could not control. When he had fired his first shots in anger 2 days after reaching the line, he had aimed at a German soldier moving between trees 70 yards distant, squeezed the trigger the way he had been taught, and watched his rounds kick up dirt 3 feet to the left of the target. The German had disappeared into cover, unharmed, and Holloway had felt a cold knot of panic settle in his chest. He had fired again, adjusted, fired again, and by the time his clip pinged free, the enemy was gone, and his squad mates were already shifting their attention to other sectors. No one had said anything, but Holloway had seen the glances exchanged between Kowalski and Corporal Dietrich, the squad's second-in-command. They were the kind of glances that conveyed assessment, judgment, and the quiet recalibration of expectations. The days that followed had been a repetition of that first failure. Contact with the enemy came in brief, chaotic bursts. A German patrol encountered at dawn, a sniper firing from an unknown position, a sudden exchange of fire across a ravine filled with shattered trees and wire. Each time, Holloway had returned fire. Each time, his shots had gone wide, high, or into cover that shielded his targets completely. He had not frozen. He had not panicked in the way that some men did, dropping their rifles or curling into the mud. He had performed the mechanics of combat, but without effect. His squad had learned to compensate. When Holloway was assigned to cover a particular arc of fire, Dietrich or one of the other riflemen would quietly adjust their own positions to overlap his sector, ensuring that any threat emerging in that direction would be engaged by someone more reliable. Holloway understood what was happening and felt the weight of it like a stone in his gut. He was not contributing. He was a liability, a gap in the line that others had to fill. Sergeant Kowalski was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, a man whose face had been weathered by sun, sand, and 2 years of sustained combat. He was not cruel, but he was pragmatic, and he had seen enough replacements come and go to know that some men adapted and some did not. On the third day, he had pulled Holloway aside during a break in movement and asked him a single question. "You scared, or you just can't shoot?" Holloway had considered lying, considered offering an excuse, but the exhaustion and honesty of the moment had won out. "I don't know, Sergeant," he had said. "I'm doing what I was taught, but it's not working." Kowalski had studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're thinking too much. You're trying to remember the steps instead of just doing it. Combat's not a checklist. You see the target, you put the sights on it, you squeeze. That's it. But you're going to have to figure that out yourself because I can't train you under fire." He had paused, glanced at the rest of the squad resting against a fallen tree, then added, "Just don't get anyone else killed while you're figuring it out." The words had not been meant as cruelty, but they had cut deeper than any insult. Holloway knew that Kowalski was right. His failures were not abstract. They were operational. If he failed to engage a target, someone else had to do it, and that meant exposing themselves, taking risks, burning ammunition. If he failed at the wrong moment, someone could die. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him constantly, mingling with the physical exhaustion of moving through the forest, the cold that seeped through his wool uniform, the hunger that came from irregular rations, and the pervasive fear that accompanied every step into terrain the enemy controlled. He wanted to prove himself, wanted to demonstrate that he was not a burden. But wanting was not enough. Intent did not place rounds on target. Confidence did not steady his hands when the shooting started. On the evening of the 6th day, the squad received orders to move forward and occupy a position along a narrow logging road that cut through the forest. Intelligence, such as it was, suggested that German forces were shifting in the sector, possibly preparing for a counterattack or attempting to infiltrate Allied lines under cover of darkness. The battalion was stretched thin, and every available unit was being pushed into defensive positions to cover the gaps. Kowalski gathered the squad, laid out the grid coordinates on a mud-smeared map, and explained the mission with the tired efficiency of a man who had done this too many times. They would hold the road junction through the night, maintain watch in pairs, and report any movement. If they encountered enemy forces, they were to delay and call for support. If they were overrun, they were to fall back to a secondary position marked on the map. No one asked questions. There was nothing to ask. The move to the position took 2 hours. The squad advancing in single file through undergrowth that tore at their uniforms and equipment. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of their movement and the distant rumble of artillery, a constant background noise that had become as familiar as breathing. They reached the junction as dusk settled over the trees, the light fading into a gray murk that made distance impossible to judge. Kowalski assigned positions, placing men in a loose perimeter around the junction, and designated watch rotations. Holloway was paired with a rifleman named Patterson for the second watch, scheduled to begin at midnight. Patterson was 22, a farmer from Iowa, and he had been with the unit since Normandy. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to Holloway since his arrival, but he was competent, steady, and Holloway was grateful not to be alone. As the squad settled into position, Holloway checked his rifle for what felt like the 100th time that day. The M1 was clean, the action smooth, the on-block clip fully loaded with 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield. He had 4 additional clips in his cartridge belt, 32 rounds total, and he knew that if contact came, those rounds would have to count. He thought about Kowalski's words, about the mechanics of shooting, about the gap between what he knew he should do and what his body actually did under fire. He thought about the men around him, resting against trees or sitting in the mud, exhausted and trusting that everyone would do their job. And he thought about the fact that his job so far had been a series of failures that others had quietly covered for. The weight of his inexperience sat on his shoulders like a physical burden, and as the darkness deepened and the forest grew colder, he wondered if tonight would be the night when his failures became something more than an embarrassment, when they became a cost someone else would have to pay. Contact and the collapse of confidence. The first shots came at dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain, and the fog lay thick between the trees like something solid. Holloway had been awake for 20 minutes. His watch rotation ended, sitting with his back against a moss-covered log and trying to coax warmth into his hands by gripping his rifle. The forest had been silent except for the occasional drip of condensation from the canopy and the low murmur of voices as the next watch took their positions. Then the silence broke. The crack of a rifle shot, sharp and impossibly loud, snapped through the fog, followed immediately by the distinctive rattle of a German MG-42 machine gun opening up from somewhere to the northeast. The sound was unmistakable. A rate of fire so fast it sounded like fabric tearing, 1,200 rounds per minute turning the air into a corridor of death. Holloway's body reacted before his mind caught up. He rolled to his right, pressing himself into the earth behind the log, his rifle coming up instinctively even though he had no target. No idea where the fire was coming from. Around him, the squad was moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Kowalski was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the noise, directing fire sectors and calling for the BAR gunner to shift position. Dietrich was already returning fire, short, controlled bursts aimed at the tree line where muzzle flashes flickered like fireflies in the gloom. Patterson dropped into cover beside Holloway, his rifle up, scanning for targets. "Northeast sector, maybe 80 yards, he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "At least 3 of them, maybe more. Stay sharp." Holloway tried to steady his breathing, tried to remember what he was supposed to do. He lifted his head above the log, squinting into the fog, looking for movement, for shapes, for anything that resembled a target. The MG-42 was still firing, rounds cracking overhead and thudding into trees with wet, splintering impacts. Somewhere to his left, a man screamed, a short strangled sound that ended abruptly. Holloway felt his chest tighten, felt the adrenaline flooding his system like ice water, and forced himself to focus. There, movement between two trees, a shadow resolving into the outline of a man moving low and fast, a coal scuttle helmet visible for just a second before disappearing behind cover. Holloway swung his rifle toward the spot, placed the front sight post where the man had been, and fired. The M1 kicked against his shoulder, the report lost in the noise of the firefight. He did not see where the round went. The target was gone, and Holloway did not know if he had missed or if the man had simply moved. He shifted his aim, searching for another target, and saw a second figure darting between positions, closer now, maybe 60 yards. He fired again, and this time he saw the impact, a spray of bark exploding from a tree trunk 3 feet to the right of the German. The man dropped into cover, unharmed, and Holloway felt the first cold edge of panic beginning to creep into his thoughts. He adjusted his aim, fired a third time, and watched the round kick up dirt 5 feet short of the target. His hands were shaking. His breathing was too fast, too shallow, and the rifle, that had felt familiar and solid during training, now felt like a foreign object, heavy and uncooperative. Patterson fired twice in quick succession, and one of the German soldiers jerked backward and fell. Holloway barely registered it. He was too focused on his own failures, on the fact that he had fired 3 rounds and accomplished nothing. The MG-42 shifted its fire, raking their position, and Holloway pressed himself into the mud as rounds snapped overhead, so close he could feel the pressure of their passage. Kowalski was still shouting, coordinating the squad's response, but Holloway could not make out the words. Everything was noise and movement, and the overwhelming realization that he was not doing his job. He forced himself to look up again to find another target and saw a German soldier rising from cover to throw something. A stick grenade, the distinctive wooden handle visible even through the fog. Holloway fired without thinking, without aiming properly, and the round went wide. The German completed his throw, the grenade arcing through the air, tumbling end over end before disappearing into the undergrowth 20 yards to Holloway's right. The explosion was a dull crump, followed by a scream and the sound of someone thrashing in the brush. Holloway fired again at the German who had thrown the grenade, but the man was already dropping back into cover, and Holloway's round hit nothing but air. His rifle's clip pinged free, ejecting automatically, and he fumbled for a fresh one, his hands slick with sweat and mud. He slammed the new clip home, heard the bolt slam forward, and brought the rifle back up, scanning desperately for a target, for anything he could engage, for any way to prove that he was contributing, and not just cowering behind a log while his squadmates did the work. But the targets were too fast, too well trained, and Holloway was too slow. Every time he found a German in his sights, the man was already moving, already behind cover, and Holloway's shots were always a half-second too late, always a few feet too far to one side or the other. He fired at movement, at shadows, at the spaces where he thought the enemy might be, and every round disappeared into the forest without effect. He could feel the weight of his inadequacy like a physical thing pressing down on him, making his movements clumsy and his thoughts sluggish. Beside him, Patterson was firing with methodical precision, each shot deliberate and controlled, and Holloway felt a surge of something that might have been envy or shame, or both. Patterson was doing what soldiers were supposed to do. Holloway was just making noise. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Germans broke contact as suddenly as they had engaged, their fires slackening and then stopping altogether as they withdrew deeper into the forest. Kowalski ordered the squad to hold position, to stay in cover and watch for a follow-up attack. And for several long minutes the only sound was the ragged breathing of exhausted men and the soft moans of the wounded. Holloway remained pressed against the log, his rifle still aimed at the tree line, his heart hammering in his chest. He had fired an entire clip and part of a second one, 12 rounds, and he had not hit a single target. He knew it, and he knew that everyone else knew it. Patterson had not said anything, but he had seen the other man's glances, the quick assessments that veteran soldiers made without thinking. Dietrich was moving among the squad, checking for casualties, and when he passed Holloway's position, he paused, looked at him for a long moment, then moved on without comment. The silence was worse than any criticism. 2 men had been wounded. One had taken shrapnel from the grenade. The one Holloway had failed to stop, and was being bandaged by the squad's medic, a thin, quiet man named Garza, who worked with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for emotion. The other had been grazed by a machine gun round, a long, bloody furrow across his shoulder that looked worse than it was. Both would survive, but they would need to be evacuated, and that meant the squad was now down 2 rifles. Holloway helped carry one of the wounded to a sheltered position, his hands still shaking, his mind replaying the firefight over and over, cataloging every missed shot, every failure of nerve or aim or timing. He wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but there was nothing to say. Apologies did not stop grenades. Explanations did not put rounds on target. Kowalski gathered the squad once the wounded had been stabilized and the perimeter re-established. His face was streaked with mud and sweat, his eyes hard and tired, and when he spoke, his voice carried the flat authority of a man who had no patience for anything but facts. "They were probing," he said, "feeling out our position, seeing how many we've got and how we respond. They'll be back, probably tonight, and they'll bring more. We're staying put until we get relief or orders to pull back, whichever comes first. Ammo check, then rest rotation. Anyone who can sleep, sleep. We might not get another chance." Holloway conducted his ammo check in silence. He had 28 rounds remaining. He cleaned his rifle mechanically, his hands moving through the familiar motions, while his mind remained locked in the loop of his failures. He had been trained for this. He had been given a weapon, ammunition, and the opportunity to do his job, and he had failed. He had not panicked, had not fled, but the result was the same. He was a liability, a weak point in the line, and he knew that Kowalski was weighing options, considering whether to pull him from a fire position and assign him to carrying ammunition or digging latrines. Jobs for men who could not be trusted with a rifle. The thought was humiliating, but Holloway could not argue against it. He had proven, again, that he could not hit what he aimed at. He had wasted ammunition, failed to stop the grenade thrower, failed to contribute anything meaningful while men around him fought and bled and died. The rest of the day passed in tense waiting. The fog lifted slightly, but visibility remained poor, and the forest pressed in on all sides, a labyrinth of green and shadow that concealed everything. Holloway took his turn on watch, scanning the tree line with burning eyes, seeing threats in every movement of branches, every shift of light. No one spoke to him unless necessary, and he did not initiate conversation. There was nothing to say. He sat with his rifle across his knees, feeling the weight of it, the solidity of the wood and steel, and wondered why something that felt so real in his hands could become so useless the moment he needed it to work. He thought about the grenade thrower, about how close he had come to hitting the man, about how a single accurate shot might have prevented the explosion that had wounded his squadmate. He thought about the gap between intention and execution, about how much damage a single incompetent soldier could cause simply by being present and ineffective. As dusk approached and the forest darkened once again, Kowalski made his rounds, checking positions and redistributing ammunition. When he reached Holloway, he crouched beside him, studied his face for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You hit anything today?" Holloway shook his head. "No, Sergeant." Kowalski nodded, as if confirming something he had already known. "You're still pulling your shots. Flinching, maybe, or thinking too much. I don't know which, and it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're short 2 men now, and I can't afford to have a rifle on the line that isn't doing work." He paused, and Holloway felt his stomach drop, expecting to be pulled from his position, reassigned to something safer and more shameful. But Kowalski did not give that order. Instead, he said, "You're on second watch again tonight, same as yesterday. Patterson's with you. If anything moves out there, you shoot it. You don't think, you don't hesitate, you just shoot. Understand?" Holloway nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski held his gaze for another moment, then stood and moved on, leaving Holloway alone with his rifle and the growing certainty that tonight would bring another test, and that he was no more prepared for it than he had been this morning. The narrowing of options. The German counterattack began at dusk, not with the sudden violence of the morning's probe, but with the slow, methodical pressure of a force that knew it held the advantage. Holloway was finishing a cold meal of K-ration hash when the first mortar rounds began falling, distant thumps in the forest, followed by the whistle of descending shells and the dull, concussive impacts that shook the ground and sent shrapnel hissing through the trees. The barrage was not concentrated on their position, but spread across the sector, a pattern of fire designed to disrupt, disorient, and pin Allied units in place while German infantry maneuvered. Kowalski ordered everyone into cover, and the squad pressed themselves into whatever shelter the forest offered: fallen logs, shallow depressions in the earth, the roots of ancient trees, while the shells continued to fall in erratic intervals, close enough to be terrifying, but not close enough to cause casualties. Not yet. The mortars stopped after 15 minutes, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Holloway lay in the shallow scrape he had dug with his entrenching tool, his rifle beside him, his breathing shallow and controlled. Every man in the squad knew what the silence meant. The mortars had been preparation, softening and fixing positions, and now the infantry would come. The forest was too dense for armor, too tangled for vehicles, so it would be men against men. Small unit actions fought at close range in failing light, the kind of combat where mistakes were immediately fatal and hesitation cost lives. Holloway checked his rifle again, confirmed the clip was seated, confirmed the safety was off, and tried to steady the tremor in his hands. He had 28 rounds. If the Germans came in strength, 28 rounds would not be enough, but only if those rounds found their targets. If they did not, if he missed as he had missed every other time, then the number of bullets in his cartridge belt was irrelevant. Word came down the line from Kowalski, passed in whispers from position to position. Battalion reported German movement across the sector, multiple probes developing into coordinated attacks. The unit to their left had already been engaged and was falling back. The unit to their right had lost contact entirely, either overrun or withdrawn without orders. The squad was effectively isolated, holding a position that no longer had clear flanks, and the orders were to hold as long as possible and then fall back to the secondary line if the situation became untenable. No one asked what untenable meant. They all knew. It meant when the Germans were too close, too numerous, or when holding the position would mean dying for ground that did not matter. It meant survival had become the primary objective, not victory. Holloway felt the weight of the situation settling over him like a physical burden. His squad was down 2 men, reduced to 7 effectives, and he was one of those 7 only by the most generous definition. If the Germans attacked in force, every rifle would need to contribute. Every man would need to kill or suppress or delay, and there would be no room for passengers, no tolerance for someone who fired without effect. He thought about Kowalski's words from the morning, about not thinking and just shooting, and he tried to internalize them, tried to imagine what it would feel like to simply react without the paralysis of self-doubt. But the trying itself was a form of thinking, and he could feel the familiar pattern beginning again, the loop of awareness and anxiety that turned action into hesitation. The Germans came as the last light faded from the sky, advancing through the forest in a skirmish line that Holloway did not see until they were impossibly close. The first indication was movement, shadows detaching from trees and moving with purpose, and then the sound of boots on forest floor, the clink of equipment, the low, guttural voices speaking a language that Holloway did not understand, but recognized instantly as the enemy. Kowalski did not wait for them to close further. He opened fire first, a single aimed shot that dropped the lead German soldier, and then the entire squad erupted, rifles and the BAR firing in a ragged volley that tore into the advancing line. Holloway brought his rifle up, found a target, a man running low between 2 trees, and fired. The round went high, clipping branches. He adjusted, fired again, and saw the dirt kick up short. The German dove into cover, and Holloway had lost him. The firefight was immediate and brutal, closer than the morning engagement, close enough that Holloway could see faces in the muzzle flashes, could hear the shouts and curses of men fighting for their lives. The Germans returned fire with disciplined aggression, their rounds snapping through the squad's position, forcing everyone down, suppressing movement. Holloway fired at shapes, at movement, at anything that might be a target, and each time he squeezed the trigger, he felt the cold certainty that the round was not going where it needed to go. His clip pinged free after 8 shots, and he reloaded, his hands moving automatically while his mind screamed at him to slow down, to aim properly, to do something that mattered. He brought the rifle back up and saw a German soldier rising to throw a grenade, the same motion he had seen that morning, and this time Holloway fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, willing at least one of them to connect. None did. The grenade arced through the air and exploded 15 feet from Dietrich's position, and Holloway heard the corporal scream, a sound of pain and shock that cut through the noise of battle. Patterson killed the grenade thrower with a single shot, and then shifted to engage another target, his movements smooth and unhurried despite the chaos. Holloway wanted to do the same, wanted to find that calm center that allowed experienced soldiers to function under fire, but he could not. His world had narrowed to the desperate cycle of seeing, aiming, firing, and missing. He was burning through ammunition, 18 rounds fired now, and he had not contributed a single effective shot. Beside him, the BAR gunner was laying down suppressive fire, long bursts that forced the Germans to keep their heads down, and Kowalski was directing fire, calling out targets, trying to coordinate a defense that was beginning to fracture under pressure. The Germans were not retreating. They were pressing the attack, and Holloway could feel the momentum shifting, could sense the point approaching when holding the position would transition from difficult to impossible. Dietrich was still screaming. Garza, the medic, was trying to reach him, crawling through the undergrowth while rounds cracked overhead. And Holloway felt a surge of guilt so intense it was almost physical. He had not stopped the grenade thrower. He had fired, had tried, but trying was not enough. And now Dietrich was wounded because Holloway could not do the one thing he had been trained to do. He forced himself to focus, to push the guilt aside and concentrate on the immediate threat. He saw another German moving, aimed, fired, and again the round missed. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold the rifle steady, and he knew that shaking was part of the problem, that fear and adrenaline were turning his body into something unreliable. But knowing did not help. He could not simply will himself to be calm. He could not think his way into competence. The Germans began to flank, moving through the forest to the squad's right, exploiting the gap left by the unit that had lost contact. Kowalski saw it happening and made a decision. "Fall back!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Bound by pairs! Pull back to secondary! Move!" The squad began to disengage, a maneuver that required discipline and coordination. Half the men providing covering fire while the others withdrew, then reversing roles. Holloway fired his remaining rounds in the general direction of the enemy, not aiming at anything specific, just trying to add volume to the covering fire. And then he was up and moving, running low through the trees, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. He covered 20 yards and dropped into cover behind a thick oak, his rifle up, ready to provide covering fire for the next pair. But his hands were empty. His rifle was empty. He had fired his entire clip during the withdrawal and had not even noticed. He reloaded with trembling fingers, fumbling the clip twice before getting it seated, and by the time he was ready to fire, the rest of the squad had already pulled back past him. He was alone, 30 yards ahead of the new defensive line, and the Germans were still coming. He could hear them moving through the brush, closer now, and he knew he needed to move, needed to fall back to the squad, but his legs would not respond. He was frozen, not by fear exactly, but by the overwhelming certainty that he had failed again, that his presence here was worse than useless, that he was a danger to everyone around him. Patterson appeared beside him, materializing out of the darkness, and grabbed his shoulder. "Move, Holloway," he hissed. "Now!" The command broke through Holloway's paralysis, and he ran, stumbling over roots and fallen branches, Patterson right behind him, and they crashed into the secondary position where Kowalski was already repositioning the squad for another stand. Dietrich was being tended to by Garza, his leg torn open by shrapnel, his face pale and slick with sweat. The corporal would survive, but he was out of the fight, another rifle lost. The squad was down to 6 effectives now, and the Germans were regrouping for another push. Kowalski conducted a hasty ammo count, and the numbers were grim. The BAR was down to 2 magazines. Most of the riflemen were below 20 rounds. Holloway reported 14 rounds remaining, and Kowalski's expression flickered with something that might have been resignation or calculation. "You're on watch tonight," Kowalski said, his voice flat. "Second rotation, same as before. If they hit us again before then, you stay on the line and you fire at anything that moves. I don't care if you miss. I need volume. I need them to think we've got more guns than we do. Understand?" Holloway nodded, understanding the unspoken message. He was being kept in a combat role, not because Kowalski trusted him, but because there was no one else. The sergeant was out of options. Night fell completely, and the forest became a void, impenetrable and hostile. The Germans did not press the attack immediately, but everyone knew they were out there, probing, waiting, choosing their moment. The squad settled into the new position, exhausted and depleted, and prepared for a long night. Holloway sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap, and stared into the darkness. He thought about the men who had been wounded, about the ammunition he had wasted, about the fact that his next opportunity to fire might be his last. He thought about Kowalski's words, "I don't care if you miss," and realized that the sergeant had given up on him. Holloway was no longer expected to contribute meaningfully. He was simply expected to make noise, to create the illusion of resistance, while the competent soldiers did the actual work. The knowledge was bitter, but Holloway could not argue with it. He had proven, repeatedly and thoroughly, that he could not be trusted with anything more. When his watch rotation came, 2 hours after midnight, he took his position at the edge of the perimeter with a rifleman named Keller, a quiet man from Michigan who had been with the squad since Normandy. Keller said nothing as they settled into their observation post, a shallow depression overlooking a narrow approach through the trees. The forest was utterly silent, the kind of silence that felt predatory, and Holloway strained his eyes against the darkness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, and knowing that the enemy was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. His hands gripped his rifle so tightly that his fingers ached, and he knew that when the moment came, when he had to fire again, the outcome would be the same. He would miss, he would fail, and this time, someone might die because of it. The weight of that certainty pressed down on him as the minutes crawled past, and he waited for the test he knew he could not pass. The approach of the threat. The forest at night was not simply dark. It was a living absence, a space where sight became useless and every other sense sharpened to compensate. Holloway sat in the shallow depression beside Keller, his rifle resting across his knees, and listened to the world beyond the perimeter. The sound of his own breathing seemed impossibly loud, each exhale a betrayal of position, and he forced himself to breathe through his nose, slow and controlled, the way he had been taught during training. Beside him, Keller was motionless, a shadow among shadows, his eyes fixed on the approach they were assigned to watch. The other man's stillness was unnerving, the kind of absolute calm that came from experience and acceptance, and Holloway envied it, even as he knew he could not replicate it. His own body was a tangle of tension, muscles coiled and waiting, hands slick with sweat despite the cold. The watch rotation was scheduled for 2 hours, from midnight until 2 in the morning, and they were 40 minutes in when Holloway heard the first sound that did not belong. It was distant, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of the forest, the drip of moisture from leaves, the creak of branches shifting in the breeze. But it was there, a soft scrape, like a boot sliding against bark. Holloway's breath caught, and he strained to hear it again, to confirm that he had not imagined it. Keller shifted slightly, a fractional movement of his head, and Holloway knew the other man had heard it too. They waited, motionless, and the sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the faint rustle of fabric brushing against undergrowth. Someone was moving through the forest ahead of them, moving slowly and carefully, trying to remain undetected. Holloway's pulse hammered in his ears. His first instinct was to wake Kowalski, to alert the squad, but that decision carried risk. If the sound was an animal, or a trick of acoustics, or his own fear conjuring threats from nothing, then waking the squad would reveal him as unreliable, jumpy, a soldier who could not distinguish real threats from imagined ones. If the sound was real, however, if German infantry were probing the perimeter, feeling for weaknesses, preparing to strike, then waiting too long could mean disaster. He glanced at Keller, trying to read the other man's reaction, and saw only the same disciplined stillness. Keller had not moved, had not signaled alarm, and Holloway took that as guidance. They would wait. They would confirm. The minutes stretched, each one an eternity, and the sounds continued. They were not random. They followed a pattern, a rhythm of movement and pause that suggested deliberate approach. Holloway tried to gauge distance, tried to visualize where the source of the sound might be, but the darkness made estimation impossible. The forest swallowed perspective, turned every yard into a void where threats could materialize without warning. He tightened his grip on his rifle, felt the familiar weight of the weapon, and thought about what would happen if he had to fire. He had 14 rounds. If the Germans came in force, 14 rounds would disappear in seconds. And if those rounds did not find targets, if he missed, as he had missed every other time, then the noise would accomplish nothing except to reveal his position and draw return fire. He thought about Kowalski's words, "I don't care if you miss," and realized that even making noise required judgment. Firing too soon would be as bad as firing too late. Keller moved then, a slow, deliberate shift, and brought his rifle up to a ready position. The movement was smooth, practiced, and it sent a clear message. The threat was real. Holloway mirrored him, bringing his own rifle up, settling the stock against his shoulder, his finger resting beside the trigger guard. His hands were steadier than they had been during the firefights, the adrenaline tempered by the need for silence and control. But he could feel the tremor waiting beneath the surface, ready to surge the moment action became necessary. He peered into the darkness, trying to see what Keller saw, trying to find the source of the sounds, and gradually, impossibly, shapes began to resolve from the void. There were men out there. Holloway could not see them clearly, could not count them or identify their equipment, but he could see movement, the darker suggestion of human forms against the background darkness, low and advancing with the kind of cautious aggression that marked trained infantry. They were 50 yards out, maybe less, and they were coming directly toward the squad's position. Holloway's breath froze in his lungs. This was not a probe. This was an infiltration. German soldiers attempting to close on the Allied perimeter under cover of darkness, to get within grenade range or knife range, to cause havoc before the defenders could react. If they reached the perimeter undetected, they would tear through the squad's position, and the exhausted men sleeping in shallow foxholes would have no chance to respond. Keller made his decision. He rose slightly, bringing his rifle to bear, and fired a single shot into the darkness. The muzzle flash was blinding, a brief star of light that destroyed Holloway's night vision, and the report was shockingly loud, shattering the silence. The round must have found a target or come close, because the advancing shapes scattered, dropping into cover, and the forest erupted with noise. Shouts in German, the crash of bodies moving through undergrowth, the metallic click of weapons being brought to bear. Behind them, the squad was waking, men scrambling from sleep to combat readiness in the space of seconds, and Kowalski was shouting orders, demanding sit-reps, coordinating response. Holloway fired. He did not aim at a specific target because he could not see one. He aimed at the space where he had seen movement, at the darkness that had resolved into men, and he squeezed the trigger. The M1 kicked, the flash momentarily illuminating a frozen tableau of trees and shadows, and then darkness slammed back down. He did not know if he had hit anything. He fired again, adjusting his aim slightly to the left, and again, working the trigger in a rhythm that felt desperate and uncontrolled. The Germans returned fire, muzzle flashes blossoming in the darkness like malignant flowers, and rounds snapped past Holloway's head, close enough that he felt the pressure wave, the displaced air that marked near misses. He dropped lower into the depression, his shoulder pressed against the cold earth, and continued to fire, each shot a guess, a prayer, a hope that volume might compensate for accuracy. Keller was firing in controlled bursts, 2 rounds and then a pause, shifting his aim between shots, working methodically despite the chaos. The bar opened up from deeper in the perimeter, its heavier caliber rounds tearing through the forest, suppressing the German advance. Holloway's rifle ran dry, the clip ejecting with its distinctive ping, and he reloaded, his hands shaking now, the adrenaline no longer held in check. He had 6 rounds left after this clip, 6 rounds, and then he would be reduced to a bayonet and desperation. He brought the rifle back up, searching for targets, and saw a figure moving closer, much closer than before. A German soldier who had used the covering fire to advance and was now 15 yards away, a grenade in his hand, arm drawing back to throw. Holloway fired without thinking, without the usual cascade of doubt and hesitation. He simply put the front sight on the center mass of the figure and pulled the trigger. The rifle barked. The muzzle flash illuminated the scene for a fraction of a second, and the German staggered, the grenade tumbling from his hand. It hit the ground and rolled, and Holloway's mind screamed at him to move, to get away. But his body was frozen, locked in place by shock and disbelief. The grenade exploded, but it was behind the German, not in front, the blast shielded by the man's falling body. The concussion washed over Holloway, dirt and debris pelting his helmet, his ears ringing. But he was untouched. The German lay where he had fallen, motionless. Holloway stared at the body, unable to process what had just happened. He had fired, and the man had fallen. Cause and effect, action and result. The thing he had been trying and failing to achieve for days. And now it had happened. And he did not know if it had been skill or luck, or simply the blind inevitability of firing enough rounds at close enough range. Keller was still firing, engaging other targets, and Holloway forced himself to look away from the body to scan for additional threats. The German advance had stalled, the surviving soldiers falling back into the darkness, their infiltration attempt broken. The squad's fire slackened as targets disappeared, and then there was only the ringing silence and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. Kowalski appeared beside them, moving low and fast, his rifle up and ready. "You good?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Keller nodded. "Good, Sergeant. They tried to rush us, maybe 6 or 8 of them. We dropped at least 2. Kowalski looked at Holloway, and Holloway nodded as well, not trusting his voice. The sergeant's gaze shifted to the body lying 15 yards out, barely visible in the darkness. "That yours?" he asked. Holloway hesitated, then said, "I think so, Sergeant. He was about to throw a grenade." Kowalski studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Stay sharp. They might try again." He moved back toward the center of the perimeter, coordinating the squad's response, and Holloway was left alone with Keller and the body and the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. The rest of the watch passed without incident. The Germans did not return, either regrouping for another attempt or abandoning the infiltration entirely. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Keller stood and stretched, his movements stiff and tired. "You did good," he said quietly, and Holloway looked at him startled. Keller rarely spoke, and praise from him felt significant in a way that orders or criticism did not. "Just kept firing," Holloway said, his voice flat. "Didn't really aim." Keller shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You put him down when it counted." That's what matters. He checked his rifle, then added, "First kill?" Holloway nodded. "Yeah." Keller nodded in return, as if confirming something. "It gets easier. Not better, but easier." He turned and walked back toward the perimeter, leaving Holloway alone. Holloway looked at the body again, now visible in the growing light. The German was young, maybe Holloway's age, his face turned away, his uniform torn and bloody. Holloway felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, no relief. Only a cold, empty space where emotion should have been. He had killed a man. He had done the thing that soldiers were supposed to do, the thing he had been failing to do, and now that it was done, he did not know what to feel. He thought about the grenade, about how close he had come to dying, about how the German's throw had been interrupted by Holloway's shot, and he realized that if he had missed, if the round had gone wide as so many others had, the grenade would have landed in his position, and he would be dead. Luck, skill, desperation. It did not matter. The result was the same. He had survived, and the German had not. Kowalski called for Holloway to return to the perimeter, and he obeyed, moving mechanically, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The squad was preparing for the day, checking equipment, redistributing ammunition, tending to Dietrich, who was pale and feverish but stable. No one mentioned Holloway's kill. There was no congratulation, no acknowledgement, only the same exhausted routine of men who had survived another night and knew there would be more nights to come. Holloway found a spot against a tree, sat down heavily, and closed his eyes. He had 6 rounds left. He had killed 1 German. The math of survival was still tilted against him, and he knew that the test was not over. It had only just begun. The final round. The day passed in a fog of exhaustion and waiting. Holloway moved through the hours in a kind of numb automaticity, performing tasks without thought, responding to orders without question. The squad remained in the secondary position, too depleted to advance, too exposed to remain without reinforcement. Word came down from battalion that relief was being organized, but it would not arrive until nightfall at the earliest. Until then, they were to hold, conserve ammunition, and report any enemy activity. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, and the silence felt like a held breath, a pause before something inevitable. Holloway cleaned his rifle, checked his remaining ammunition, 6 rounds, and tried not to think about the body lying in the undergrowth 30 yards from their perimeter. Other men had gone forward during the day to search the German casualties, retrieving maps and documents that might contain intelligence, but Holloway had not been asked to participate. He had remained at his position, staring into the trees and waiting. Keller's words stayed with him. "First kill. It gets easier." Holloway did not know if that was true, and he was not sure he wanted it to be. The act of killing should not be easy. It should carry weight, should leave a mark, should demand something from the person who did it. But Keller had not been talking about morality or conscience. He had been talking about function, about the mechanical process of identifying threats and neutralizing them. In that sense, perhaps it did get easier. Perhaps the hesitation faded, the doubt receded, and the body learned to respond without the interference of thought. Holloway had experienced a glimpse of that during the firefight, the moment when he had fired without the usual paralysis, without the cascade of self-doubt. But he did not know if it had been a breakthrough or an accident. One shot, under extreme pressure, at close range. It did not prove competence. It proved only that even a broken clock was right twice a day. As dusk approached, Kowalski gathered the squad for final instructions. His face was drawn, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing smoke, but his authority remained absolute. "We're on our own tonight," he said. "Relief's been delayed. Battalions got their hands full across the sector, and we're low priority because we're not in immediate contact. That could change fast. The Germans know we're here, know we're under strength, and they're going to want this position before we can be reinforced. So we dig in, we stay alert, and we do not let them get close." Ammo status. He went around the perimeter, each man reporting his remaining rounds. The numbers were grim. The BAR was down to 30 rounds. Most riflemen had between 8 and 15. Holloway reported 6. Kowalski's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Make them count," he said. "If it comes down to it, fix bayonets. We're not giving up this position without a fight." The watch rotations were assigned. Holloway was paired with Patterson this time, taking the midnight to 2 shift again, covering the same approach he had watched the previous night. Patterson was silent as they moved into position, his rifle slung, his movements economical and precise. He did not mention the kill from the night before, did not offer commentary or advice, and Holloway was grateful for the silence. They settled into the depression, and the forest darkened around them, the temperature dropping, the cold seeping through Holloway's uniform and into his bones. He was so tired that staying awake required active effort, and he focused on his breathing, on the sensory details of his environment, on anything that would keep his mind engaged. 2 hours. He could stay awake for 2 hours. The Germans came at 1:15. There was no warning, no sound of approach, just the sudden eruption of movement and fire from the northeast. A different angle than the previous night's infiltration. Grenades exploded in the perimeter, their detonations close and devastating, and the night was torn apart by the chatter of machine gun fire and the crack of rifles. Holloway and Patterson were up instantly, turning toward the sound, and Patterson was already firing, engaging targets that Holloway could not yet see. "They're in the perimeter!" someone shouted, and Holloway felt his stomach drop. This was not a probe. This was an assault. German infantry closing to hand range, exploiting the darkness and the squad's exhaustion. Holloway ran toward the sound, Patterson beside him, and they crashed into the chaos. The perimeter had become a confused melee of shadows and muzzle flashes, friend and foe intermixed, the kind of close-range nightmare where identification was nearly impossible. Holloway saw a figure rising from the ground, saw the distinctive silhouette of a German helmet, and fired. The man fell, and Holloway did not know if it was his shot or Patterson's or simple coincidence. 5 rounds left. He moved forward, trying to find cover, trying to understand the tactical situation, and saw Kowalski grappling with a German soldier, the 2 men locked together, fighting for control of a rifle. Holloway raised his weapon, trying to get a clean shot, but they were moving too fast, too close, and he could not risk hitting the sergeant. Patterson fired twice, and the German jerked and fell away from Kowalski. The sergeant stumbled, caught himself, and shouted orders that were lost in the noise. Holloway moved past him, deeper into the perimeter, and saw another German soldier silhouetted against the faint glow of a burning tree. Someone had used a flare or incendiary, and the light was spreading, casting flickering shadows that made targeting nearly impossible. The German was armed with a submachine gun, sweeping it in an arc, firing short bursts, and Holloway dropped to the ground as rounds cracked overhead. He brought his rifle up, aimed at the center of the silhouette, and fired. 4 rounds left. The German did not fall. Holloway fired again, adjusting, and this time the man staggered, dropping the submachine gun. 3 rounds. The firefight was collapsing into individual duels, small, desperate struggles scattered across the perimeter. Holloway moved toward the BAR position, where he could hear the weapon still firing in short, disciplined bursts, and found the gunner slumped over his weapon, unmoving. Holloway checked for a pulse, found none, and grabbed the BAR, hauling it up. The weapon was heavy, unfamiliar in his hands. He had trained on it but never fired one in combat, and he fumbled with the mechanism, trying to remember how to operate it. The bolt was locked back, empty. He released the magazine, found it dry, and searched the gunner's body for a spare. There was one, tucked into the man's belt, and Holloway slammed it home, charged the weapon, and brought it to his shoulder. The BAR roared, bucking against him, and he fought to control it, sweeping fire across the sector where he had seen Germans advancing. The weapon ran dry after 10 rounds, and Holloway dropped it, unslung his rifle, and moved again. 2 rounds left. The fighting was beginning to ebb, the German assault losing momentum as their casualties mounted and the squad's desperate resistance held. Holloway moved through the smoke and darkness, searching for targets, for threats, for anything he could engage, and saw a German soldier crouched behind a tree, aiming at Patterson's position. Holloway did not hesitate. He brought his rifle up, centered the front sight, and fired. The German flinched, turned toward Holloway, his weapon swinging around, and Holloway realized with cold certainty that he had missed. 1 round left. The German's rifle was coming to bear, the muzzle dark and enormous, and Holloway knew he had one chance, one final opportunity to do what he had been failing to do for days. He steadied his breathing, blocked out the noise and chaos, and focused entirely on the front sight and the target. He squeezed the trigger. The M1 fired its last round, and the German soldier fell. Holloway did not see the impact, did not see the man's reaction, only the result, the body collapsing, the rifle clattering against the tree. The shot had connected. Center mass, decisive, final. Holloway stood frozen, his rifle empty, the smell of cordite thick in his nose, and felt nothing except the hollow certainty that it was over. He had no ammunition left. If another German appeared, he would have only his bayonet, his hands, and whatever desperate violence he could summon. But no one appeared. The forest was quieting, the gunfire tapering to sporadic shots and then silence. The German assault had broken, the survivors retreating into the darkness, leaving their dead behind. Holloway walked forward slowly, his empty rifle held loosely, and approached the German he had killed. The man was young, younger than Holloway, his face visible now in the growing light of the burning tree. He had been shot through the chest, a clean hit, and he had died quickly. Holloway stared at the body, trying to feel something, remorse, satisfaction, horror, relief, but there was only emptiness. This was the second man he had killed, and it had taken his last bullet. The math of it felt significant in a way he could not articulate. He had failed 47 times, succeeded twice, and those 2 successes had been the difference between life and death. Not just his own life, but Patterson's, possibly others. The grenade thrower from the night before, this rifleman tonight. 2 kills, 2 moments when his failures had finally resolved into function. Kowalski appeared beside him, moving through the perimeter, checking casualties, assessing damage. He looked at the German, then at Holloway, then at the empty rifle in Holloway's hands. "You out?" he asked. Holloway nodded. "Last round, Sergeant." Kowalski's expression was unreadable. "You get him with it?" Holloway nodded again. Kowalski looked at the body for a long moment, then said, "He was about to shoot Patterson. I saw it. You saved his life." He paused, then added, "Good shooting." The words were simple, matter of fact, and they carried more weight than any formal commendation. Kowalski moved on, continuing his assessment, and Holloway was left standing over the body, his empty rifle in his hands. The rest of the night passed in a daze. The squad consolidated, treated the wounded, and counted the cost. 2 men dead, including the BAR gunner. 3 more wounded, including Dietrich from the previous day. The German casualties were higher, 7 bodies in and around the perimeter, but the numbers felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of what had happened. Holloway helped where he could, carrying ammunition from the dead, redistributing gear, digging shallow graves for the men who would not see morning. No one spoke to him directly, but the glances had changed. They were no longer dismissive or pitying, they were simply acknowledgement. He had done his job. He had contributed. The failures that had defined his first days in combat had been, if not erased, then at least balanced by the 2 moments when he had done what was required. As dawn broke and the forest emerged from darkness, Holloway sat against a tree and cleaned his rifle. The weapon was empty, useless without ammunition. But he cleaned it anyway, the ritual providing something solid to focus on. Patterson appeared carrying a bandolier of M1 clips scavenged from one of the dead. He dropped it beside Holloway without comment, then sat down heavily. "You did good last night," Patterson said after a long silence. Holloway looked at him, too tired to respond. Patterson continued. "Kowalski said you got the guy who was about to drop me. Said it was your last round." Holloway nodded. "Yeah." Patterson was quiet for a moment, then said, "Thank you." Holloway did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. They sat together in silence, watching the light spread through the forest, and waited for relief that might or might not come. After, morning arrived with no fanfare, only the gradual dissolution of darkness into gray light that revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The perimeter was littered with debris, spent shell casings, fragments of equipment, dark stains in the earth that marked where men had bled and died. The German bodies had been dragged to the edge of the position and searched, their documents and identification tags collected for intelligence. Holloway had not participated in that task. He had remained at his position, methodically loading the ammunition Patterson had given him, restoring his rifle to a state of readiness, even though the likelihood of immediate contact had diminished. The weight of the weapon in his hands felt different now, not heavier or lighter, but changed in some fundamental way. It was no longer an implement of failure. It was simply a tool, one he had finally learned to use when it mattered most. Kowalski moved through the perimeter with Garza, assessing the wounded and making decisions about evacuation. Dietrich was stable but needed proper medical attention, as did 2 others who had been hit during the night assault. The dead had been laid out side by side, covered with shelter halves, their rifles staked in the ground beside them in the traditional marker of fallen soldiers. Holloway had known their names but not their stories, and now he never would. The war had a way of reducing men to functions: rifleman, machine gunner, medic, and death erased even those distinctions, leaving only the absence where a person had been. He thought about the 2 Germans he had killed, about the fact that they had also been someone's son or brother or friend, and the thought was almost too large to process. So he set it aside, the way soldiers learned to set aside everything that did not contribute to immediate survival. The relief force arrived just after 0800 hours, a platoon from another company moving up to take over the position while Holloway's squad was pulled back to rest and refit. The arriving soldiers looked fresh, their uniforms relatively clean, their faces unmarked by the exhaustion and trauma that came from sustained combat. They moved past the battered squad with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, recognizing the signs of a unit that had been tested and survived. Kowalski briefed their lieutenant, a young officer who listened with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood the gravity of what he was being told. The German activity in the sector, the strength of their probes, the likelihood of further attacks, all of it was information that might keep the relief force alive. And Kowalski delivered it with the flat precision of a man who had learned that details mattered. The squad gathered its gear and began the march back to the battalion assembly area, moving in a loose column through the forest. Holloway walked near the rear, his rifle slung, his eyes scanning the terrain out of habit even though the immediate threat had passed. The forest looked different in daylight, less oppressive. The trees merely trees rather than cover for unseen enemies. But the familiarity was deceptive. The Hurtgen remained a contested sector, and the relative quiet of morning could dissolve into violence without warning, as men moved carefully, alert despite their exhaustion, and the march took 2 hours over ground that should have required half that time. The battalion assembly area was a collection of tents and foxholes carved into a hillside 2 miles behind the front line, far enough from immediate contact to allow for rest, but close enough that the sound of artillery was a constant presence. The squad was directed to a field kitchen where hot food was being served, the first hot meal Holloway had eaten in days, and he moved through the line mechanically, accepting whatever was placed on his tray without comment. The food was bland and lukewarm, but it was calories and warmth, and he ate it sitting on the ground with his back against a supply crate, too tired to care about taste or presentation. Around him, the other men ate in similar silence, the exhaustion too deep for conversation. After the meal, Kowalski called the squad together for a brief debrief. They gathered in a shallow draw, sitting or crouching in the mud, and the sergeant went through the events of the past 48 hours in methodical detail. The initial contact, the firefight that had wounded Dietrich, the German counterattack, the night infiltrations, the final assault. He noted what had worked, what had failed, and what needed to be improved. When he reached the part about the night watches and the close-range engagements, he looked at Holloway and said, "Private Holloway engaged and neutralized 2 enemy combatants at critical moments, preventing casualties and maintaining the integrity of the perimeter. His actions were effective and decisive." The words were formal, almost bureaucratic, but they were also public acknowledgement, and Holloway felt the weight of the squad's attention shift toward him. No one applauded or congratulated him. They simply nodded, small gestures of recognition that carried more meaning than words. Kowalski concluded the debrief by informing them that the squad would remain in the assembly area for at least 24 hours, possibly longer, while replacements were assigned and equipment was replenished. They were to clean their weapons, rest, and be ready to move back to the line when ordered. The men dispersed slowly, moving toward their assigned tents or finding quiet spots to sleep, and Holloway walked to the area designated for his squad, found an empty cot, and sat down heavily. His body ached, a deep, pervasive soreness that came from days of tension and adrenaline, and he wanted nothing more than to sleep for a week. But his mind would not quiet. The images from the firefights played in an endless loop. The muzzle flashes, the falling bodies, the German soldier raising his rifle in the instant before Holloway fired his last round. Patterson found him an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had been brewed over a field stove. He offered one to Holloway without comment, and they sat together on adjacent cots, sipping the bitter liquid in silence. After a while, Patterson said, "Kowalski put you in for a commendation. Bronze Star, maybe, for the saves. Holloway looked at him, surprised. "I didn't know that," he said. Patterson shrugged. "He doesn't always tell you, but he saw what you did. We all did. You kept your head when it mattered." Holloway did not know how to respond to that. He had not kept his head. He had barely functioned, had fired wildly and desperately, and only luck or desperation or some combination of both had allowed 2 of his shots to connect. But Patterson was offering something, respect perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that Holloway had crossed a threshold, and refusing it would be insulting. So he nodded and said, "Thank you." They finished their coffee, and Patterson left to find his own rest. Holloway remained on the cot, staring at the canvas roof of the tent, and thought about the journey from his first day on the line to this moment. He had fired 49 shots in combat, 2 had killed, 47 had missed or failed to find targets. The ratio was abysmal by any standard, but it was also no longer the defining fact of his existence. He had proven, in the moments when it mattered most, that he could function. He had not become a skilled marksman overnight, had not discovered some hidden talent that had been waiting to emerge. He had simply learned to shoot when there was no other choice, when the alternative was death. That knowledge was not comforting, but it was real. The day passed in a haze of exhaustion and routine maintenance. Holloway cleaned his rifle with obsessive thoroughness, disassembling it completely, scrubbing every component, and reassembling it until the weapon functioned with perfect smoothness. He cleaned his cartridge belt, checked his remaining equipment, and mended a tear in his uniform with a needle and thread from his pack. The tasks were mundane, repetitive, but they provided structure, and structure was a defense against the thoughts that waited at the edges of his awareness. When evening came, he ate another meal at the field kitchen, returned to his cot, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted until morning. The next day brought the arrival of replacements. Young men fresh from England, their uniforms new, their faces marked by the same nervous energy Holloway had carried a week earlier. They were assigned to fill the gaps in the squad, replacing the dead and wounded, and Holloway watched them with a strange sense of detachment. He recognized himself in their expressions, in their uncertain movements, in the way they gripped their rifles, as if the weapons might offer protection against fear. Kowalski introduced them to the squad, assigned them to positions, and began the process of integrating them into the unit. One of the replacements, a kid from Ohio named Mitchell, was assigned to share a tent with Holloway, and he peppered Holloway with questions about the fighting, about the forest, about what to expect. Holloway answered briefly, offering practical advice without embellishment. He did not mention his own failures, did not share the story of missing 47 shots, but he did tell Mitchell to trust his training, to listen to the sergeants, and to remember that surviving the first firefight was often a matter of luck as much as skill. On the 3rd day, the squad was ordered back to the line. They gathered their equipment, formed up, and began the march forward, moving once again into the contested sectors of the Hurtgen forest. Holloway moved with them, his rifle slung, his ammunition pouches full, and his mind clear. He was not confident, not transformed into a seasoned veteran by 2 kills and a handful of days under fire. He was still uncertain, still aware of his limitations, still carrying the weight of every missed shot and failed engagement. But he had learned something essential, that competence in combat was not a fixed state, not something you either possessed or lacked, but a fragile, temporary condition that had to be rebuilt with every engagement. He had failed many times, succeeded twice, and those successes had been enough. He did not know if the next firefight would reveal competence or collapse, but he knew that he would fire when required, and that was all any soldier could promise. The forest closed around them as they moved forward, and the distant rumble of artillery grew louder, a reminder that the war continued, indifferent to individual struggles or small victories. Holloway adjusted his rifle sling, checked his gear one final time, and followed the man in front of him deeper into the trees. The path ahead was uncertain, the outcome unknown, but he was no longer paralyzed by his own inadequacy. He had crossed the threshold, paid the cost, and earned the right to continue. The silence of the forest pressed in around him, and he walked forward into it, ready for whatever came next.